So thanks a lot, Mary, and to the whole SLAM series for having me out. This is pretty exciting to get to come out, even in the cold of winter, to share my work. I'll be talking about some of the things that Mary mentioned, the graphical system that we designed to support students in online discussions. But the focus is going to be a little different from that paper in that I'm also going to be talking about the larger context in which we are having students work with that and other learning analytics. So the talk for today is titled Embedded Learning Analytics, Integrating Tools in Pedagogy. And as Mary said, I'm Alyssa Wise from Simon Fraser University in Canada. So, not surprisingly for this series, this talk is about learning analytics. You're in the right room. But take a minute now and think about when I said learning analytics, what did you picture? And then take a moment to introduce yourself if you don't already know your neighbor and tell them what you pictured. All right, so it's still the beginning of things. So I want to also have us share out with a larger group and just see. So how many people pretty much drew a blank and are wondering if they're in the right room? Okay, well, that's a good start. Now I've got a couple images I'm going to flash through, and obviously these are ones I picked out. So try and think about whether conceptually what I'm showing is what you thought of, even if it doesn't look quite the same. So how many people thought about all the data out there that we can play with? Okay, and you can raise your hand more than once if you want. How many people thought about all the formulas that we think of to make sense of the data, or perhaps some of the code we write to process it? Okay, less hands, but still some hands. How many people pictured all the interesting ways we visualize the data to help people use it? Okay, is there anyone who hasn't raised their hand yet? Okay, so it's just me so far. So I think about all these things when I think about learning analytics, but I think about a couple images as well. I think about things like this. And what this is this is a perhaps slightly overworked and cold professor late at night staring at his laptop screen trying to figure out what the data means and how it's going to affect the way he teaches tomorrow. And sometimes I think about this. A couple of students working together, trying to figure out what the data is telling them and what they ought to do differently about it. So unlike, I think, a lot of learning analytics talks you may have seen, this talk is a little different. Because I truly believe that if learning analytics are going to make a real impact on university teaching and learning, and I'd say maybe even revolutionize education just a little bit, we need to consider, and we need to consider now and design for the ways in which they're going to impact the larger activity patterns of instructors and students. So the talk today is about how do we embed learning analytics, all the tools we're working to develop, in university learning and teaching practices. Because otherwise, I think we're destined for something like this, which is the digital dustbin of technologies that had great promise for education, but were oversold, underused, and really never had the impact we hoped. So I want to start off with a couple of definitions, just to make sure we're on the same page. Let's start off with learning analytics. It's the idea that we're collecting and analyzing data traces related to learning to inform the process and hopefully impact the outcomes from that process. And we can think about that as having a couple of components. One component, which some of those images represented, is the idea that we need to capture and calculate meaningful traces of what learners are doing in the first place. Another one is how do we present that data, because it can get quite overwhelming, to people in a useful form, and that may be different for learners, teachers, administrators, designers. And I think those are two problems that we've made some progress on. There's certainly a lot more to do, but we've gotten some traction. But I think that there's a third piece of the puzzle that we're just starting to be ready to play with now, and that's how do we support the interpretation and use of the analytics in decision-making in real practices. And that's saying that we need to move beyond testing the usability of analytic systems. Can somebody in a lab study make sense of what's there, to try and understand how they're going to interact with what those tools are providing them as part of real activity. And I think it's important that we do that now, because I think it's going to also inform how we design our systems. So what I want to talk about today is the idea of a learning analytics intervention. And that's the surrounding frame of activity through which we're thinking about the learning analytics being taken up by people as part of a larger educational activity. And what that gives rise to is a bunch of questions that are not technical in nature, but they're socio-technical. And so it has to do with, when should analytics be consulted? I mean, it's great that they're out there, but we're not going to consult them every minute all the time. That would actually distract from the learning activity. So at what points, in what processes, with what frequency? Who should be accessing different kinds of analytics? Which ones for adults, children, instructors, students, administrators, so on? Why are we asking them? What are we asking as questions, and what are we trying to learn from the analytics? And then centrally, what do they mean in a particular situation? And then, what do we do about it? How is it changing our activity in the world? And finally, how does that articulate with the rest of the things we're doing, right? We're all busy instructors, designers, administrators. How do we integrate the use of analytics in what we're doing as an integral part of our daily work, and not just this add-on that's taking time or distracting us? So we're thinking about support for decision making, and I wanted to just clarify the context in which my work is conducted, because I know a lot of us come from different contexts. And I think there's kind of two big classes of decision making that we can think about analytics as informing. And the first is, I would say, a little more distant from the teaching and learning process, and that's when we're looking at data on completed activities. We might be looking as an administrator over a series of courses over several years. We might be a course designer. We could be a student looking at our progress across a series of courses. But that's happening afterwards. There's also the possibility to look at analytics while activities are still in progress, and that's where it starts to be embedded in the teaching and learning. And these are different in a couple of ways, because in one case we're often going to be looking at outcome data, grades, and so on, and it's going to inform teaching and learning, but usually in another iteration. But we can also look at process data. You know, how am I doing in this course so far? How can I tweak what I'm going to do tomorrow as a teacher or learner? In one case, we have a relatively long cycle between action and then getting to see the data, whereas in the other, it's a quite short cycle. So my context in which I work in is the one over here, where we have the teachers and students interacting and perhaps generating in data and looking at it and changing what they're doing on a pretty frequent basis. But I think about these other contexts as needing the same kind of idea. So as an administrator or designer, how are we going to start to integrate it into our processes? So if that's your context, you might want to think a little bit larger than what I'm talking about specifically, but how these same kinds of ideas would apply in that context. So the way I think about these is the notion of learning analytics interventions as being pedagogical. And the idea is that these interventions are going to have a direct and immediate impact on ongoing teaching and learning processes, and they're actually going to become a part of it. So I don't see a big difference between learning analytics and learning design in the long run. And specifically, my focus today is on pedagogical learning analytic interventions for students. There's a lot we can learn as instructors by looking at learning analytics, but I feel strongly that for several reasons that I'll talk about, it's important to engage students in the process as well. There's a couple of benefits here. This is making students active partners in their own learning. It's helping them be active in thinking about their data, setting them up for lifelong learning, these good kinds of things. It also can activate metacognitive processes in their learning, which we know support the learning process already. It brings in analytics as something that's empowering versus enslaving, which I think addresses a lot of the concerns about data being collected on us as opposed to data being collected with us. And finally, no matter the scale, there's always a nice one-to-one ratio between a student and the data being generated. So it's scalable in that sense. So I think there's a couple of challenges and a couple of opportunities here. One of the big challenges is that in order to make sense of the data, we need to know what the goals of the learning activity are, and that's something that students aren't necessarily always aware of. Maybe because we haven't done a good job of letting them know, and you know, maybe because they haven't thought about it nearly as much as we have. But it's important for them to understand what's the purpose of them engaging in some activity. You know, we ask them to participate in some sort of online demo, or they use a simulation. If they don't know why they're doing it, They may not be engaging it in the way we want because they didn't understand what that was. It's going to be true for the data as well. It's also important for them to realize what productive and unproductive patterns of activity look like. And this is something we've already been working on, but we need to think about how do you engage students with that. And finally, if we're going to engage students in learning analytics, they're going to need to be using and activating and perhaps developing their self-regulation and metacognitive skills. So while there's substantial challenges, I actually think these are exciting opportunities as well, because some of this is just going to relate to good instructional practice. If students are more aware of what the purpose of an educational activity is, they're going to be better able to align what they're doing with what we're hoping will happen. Similarly, being proactive in directing and monitoring their own learning supports better learning processes and outcomes and will set them up to continue learning after they're outside of our care. So just a couple more concerns, and then we'll sort of say, how do we answer some of these challenges? A couple other concerns we need to think about with students is the transparency of data capture, analysis, and access. There's also a danger of rigidity of interpretation. As with many analytics, more isn't always better, and we want to make sure students are realizing that the numbers give us a place to start, but not necessarily always the place to end. And certainly now in the early days, where there's some things we're better at measuring than others, there's a danger of only optimizing to those things we have numbers on. And that could eliminate a lot of things that we think are valuable, and we just don't know how to measure quite yet. So let me pause right now. This is sort of just the setup of the problem, but are you with me? Are there any questions? I don't want this talk to be entirely abstract, and so what I want to do for the next little portion is just tell you a little bit about my research on learning analytics and a background on my project. And then in the third portion, what I'm going to describe is how we've taken the analytics we've developed and embedded them in learning and teaching practices, and that's sort of the goal of this all. So the project I'm going to talk about is the Elistening Project. It's a project I've run for the last 4 years or so. It's supported by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, and it's focused on one particular context, and that's learning through online discussions. Not the sexiest technology out there, but one of the most commonly used across many universities, and so I would argue quite an important one to look at. So in this project, it didn't start out as a learning analytics project. It started out as an online learning project, and we were investigating how students learned in asynchronous online discussions. How did they share their ideas? How did they attend to the ideas of others? And how did they negotiate differences in perspective? And through this conversation, learn about the content. It's hard to overview a 4-year project in just a few minutes, so at a very, very high level, we've thought about this in 2 key ways. We focused on how did students contribute comments to discussions, which we talked about as speaking, and how did they attend to others' comments, which we think of as listening. And that's part of the notion of dialogue in an online space. We looked at lots of factors of how do you structure discussions, and then what do students do as a result. And as we started to look at the patterns, we moved into a space where we saw that students are doing lots of different things, because in an online space, as opposed to a face-to-face context, students have a lot of control over how they speak and how they listen. So in this large decision space, there's students who will log in very, very often, and some who really wait a long time and then do lots of things at once. They log in for short and long periods of time. Some people attend to certain peer messages and not others. Some people try to look at everything successfully. Others try to look at everything but get overwhelmed and fail. There's also the opportunity, which you can't do face-to-face, in revisiting. So students can go back and look at posts they made, look at posts other people have made. They have as much time as they want to compose their reply. So, lots of people in the online learning space talk about the opportunities for thoughtful listening and reflective speaking, but it turns out that practically, there's a lot of challenges for students in how do you effectively allocate your time to be a participant who is really engaged in getting something out of these discussions. So in terms of a learning model, we're thinking at a basic level about students learning as they externalize their ideas. They have to articulate their thoughts. They have to defend them. They also are exposed to their peers' views, and they take in those externalizations by others. They see different perspectives. They have to negotiate, and through this way, they can come to a deeper understanding of whatever it is they're discussing. And so in looking at speaking and listening, looking at the research that was out there and research that we did, we started to see more and less productive patterns. So speaking is a mechanism for sharing ideas, and there's value, and studies support that both theoretically and practically we see value in students who are speaking recurrently. In other words, they don't come in and make a monologue, but they say something, they see what other people say, they come back and respond. They're being responsive, and specifically in most of the work I do, we look at comments being rationale. They're supporting what they're saying with evidence, which gives someone else a chance to either contest it or agree with it, but it's a basis for the discussion. It's important that they're distributing their comments temporally. Again, if you just come in and talk and leave, that's not a conversation. Also throughout the conversation, so they're being exposed to the different ideas out there. And if we're really looking at online discussions to be discussions and not monologues, you don't want students writing long essays, which is actually often a problem. So moderately portioned, not so short that they're meaningless, but not so long that no one else can get into them. While a lot of this is visible in a system, the analytics on it are not always salient in an online discussion system like the one I showed you earlier, especially as things are related to time. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of the measures we've used, and this is sort of a pre-caveat that the quality of posts, which involves analyzing the text, is really important, but it's complex to assess. There's going to be a lot of issues with students accepting the assessment of their text that's been done automatically, and so that's sort of a step we haven't yet taken. But we can still do quite a bit even without going there. On the listening side, and this is where the Elistening Project broke new ground, is we started to look at how students attended to the posts of others. And this was really the first work that had gone in depth in what students were doing, because that's something that's invisible. I can actually, and we saw quite a bit of this, students who look like they were making these really great posts, but in fact aren't listening to what anyone else is saying, so they're not involved in dialogue the way we were imagining it was happening. So what we found is that there's value in listening, that is attending to other people's posts, that is broad, because you want to consider multiple ideas, but it's also got to be deep. In other words, scanning entire discussion doesn't do much. And in one study, we were able to predict the content quality, basically how strong the argumentation of a student's posts were, based on how many previous posts they had read in depth, the percentage of the conversation they'd attended to. Because as I'm exposed to more people's ideas, I learn better how I need to defend mine, what are counter-arguments, those sorts of things. And we saw a relationship, which is important. If we're thinking dialogue matters, there should be a connection with what I hear and then what I say after. We also want comments to be integrated so that I'm not posting one day and listening another, but it's part of a dialogue happening at the same time. And this notion of being reflective. And we actually saw that students who went back and read their peer posts more than once were more responsive in their future comments. And I think that moves away from the idea of a face-to-face discussion where you hear something once and respond right away into this idea of the reflectivity we can get out of online discussions. Early research had suggested that students were generally bad at online discussions. So they've got this big promise, we use them a lot, but most discussions you study in the wild are actually quite terrible. But what we found was they're not all terrible, but different students are doing really different things. So by calculating a bunch of different variables from the clickstream data, and conducting case studies and cluster analyses and looking at different patterns, we found out there's a lot going on under the surface that other students aren't seeing, that the instructors are not seeing. And just a couple of examples, we see students who are disregardful, so they make few posts and they listen to even fewer. And we see students who are really thorough, the student who goes in and reads everything they can and replies thoughtfully. But we see other strategies in between, students who, for example, try and cover a conversation so it looks like they've looked at everything there, but they've done it so superficially they didn't get much out of it, even though they thought they were doing a good job. And students who are focused, so maybe they only look at a part of the conversation, but they're able to do so in depth, which might actually be more productive. So some of the analytics that we used in that work, which were just research instruments at the start, are up on the screen. And these are the different kinds of things that we can calculate relatively easy from the log file data in online discussions. And again, this doesn't include the quality of the posts, but there's still quite a bit there. So we can see when students are coming in, how many days they spend in the discussion, how often do they log in and both read posts and make a post, how many posts do they make, what are their length, what percentage of their peer posts do they look at least once, and what percentage do they spend enough time looking at that we can make a reasonable inference they got something out of it. And that turned out to be a quite important one, tracking how long they'd spend on a post and trying to decide based on average screen reading speeds whether we thought they at least could have gotten something out of it. The notion of reflectivity also became important, the idea of revisiting posts. So we'd worked with these analytics as part of a research instrument. And the next step, which is what we'll talk about now, is how that started to become information we could feed back to the students themselves. So some analytics we were able to embed technologically by building a new interface for discussions. So there's quite a bit of research on why for online discussions this is a pretty terrible interface. It's basically a long list. It doesn't tell you a lot about what's going on in the discussion. People find it overwhelming. You see some really bad behaviors where students either read what's at the top of the page or the bottom of the page, or they read a chunk that has nothing to do with it just because they're next to each other. So what we decided to do is try and see if we could embed some of the things we were studying in a new interface. And so this is actually the discussion forum interface that we've been using. I'll give you a minute to try and orient to it. What's interesting is this is actually the same data as the previous slide, it's just visualized differently. So this is just a short demo of, this is actually a prior version of it. But what's important about the interface that you can see here is that when you navigate to a post, not only does it turn blue, but the whole discussion focuses around it. So the idea is to help students explore related clusters of ideas. So some of the nodes that seemed really small when you were at the start to become bigger as you move towards them. And that's because some of the research on the old linear ones would show people would just kind of click at random here and there, which actually, those are not related comments, that's not part of a discussion. So what you can see here is you can follow a chain of ideas down. The whole conversation is always visible, but it gets kind of put off to the periphery as you're focusing on one piece. And it shows how you can make a post. You can actually continue to think about your ideas and make a post here. So I'll type some ideas, then I can keep navigating. So it's supposed to support students in weaving ideas together as well. And I think this goes on for probably longer than we need it to. So there we go. Are there more questions? The interface is actually not the biggest part of the analytics. So if it's all right, I think I'll move to the second half of the analytics, which is there's some analytics that it does not work to embed in the tool. I think this is a really exciting way to use analytics because it really makes it a part of the learning process. As I'm interacting with my learning activity, I'm getting analytics in the same time. It's not a separate place that I'm going. But there's things that don't work for this. And there's also possibilities that some of the analytics need to be looked at maybe more reflectively, not while I'm trying to engage in the activity. So this is a set of other analytics we've developed that are not embedded technologically, but I'm going to talk about how we embed them pedagogically in the student's experience. And this is the kind of chart that a student might see after they've engaged in a discussion for a given week, and it has some information here on what they've done, and then it gives them the class average as a benchmark. I'm looking at the time, and let me just move to try and describe a little bit about the interventions surrounding the use of the analytics. Because in some ways, I think that's the most exciting piece, and that's the piece that I think maybe would be more useful to people to take away to their own work. So it's less about the analytics I'm using, but how did we bring these into a class and make them a real part of the learning experience? So what I'm going to do is there's kind of a mix now between the black slides, which are sort of the theoretical model that we're talking about, and the white slides, which are what did it look like in practice. So we have learning analytics, and that's kind of the core of what's going on. But one of the key principles we're working with is that the learning analytics need to not be an add-on, but they need to be integrated into the whole process. And so what that means is, that didn't do it right. What that means is we're thinking about the learning analytics and the learning activities together. Oh, something's out of order. Anyway, the idea is that the use of the learning analytics needs to be part of our pedagogical design in a course, tied to the goals and expectations, tied to the guidelines for participating in the discussion, and then it's going to provide a local context for making sense of the data. So it might be something that you're able to put into a learning analytics system. You have a page the instructor can fill out, but it might also be something separate that the instructor discusses with the class and gives a handout. It can happen in different ways. But the idea is that there needs to be a local context for making sense of these things. And so there's a couple of conceptual questions, and these are the questions that I think instructors have already been thinking about as they're using analytics. Given my goals for this activity, which metrics matter here, and what do productive and unproductive patterns look like? So I'm just picking one of the metrics here, and one metric we found that research shows predicts students make better posts if they read more of their peer posts. So that's something we want to encourage them to do, because it turns out they don't actually realize that in an online discussion you might ought to do that. So this is an important one. And you can see here the numbers don't need to be exact, but this student is clearly way below the class average. So that's the metric that'll be my example. But then we have practical questions, is how do we make the thread between the goals for the activity, what a student's doing, and the analytics clear, and how do we bring that into the flow of the class? So one thing we've been working with is a process of initial grounding. In other words, we start off, and this is again the context of online discussions, but with a very clear guidelines about what's the purpose of engaging in online discussion. It turns out that students often think it's to show what they know, or it's to get information, whereas a lot of times, at least in the discussions I run, the goal is for students to put ideas out there, hear other ideas, perhaps change their ideas. So we talk about the idea of an online discussion serving that purpose. This would work just as well if your purpose is to get information, but students need to know why they're doing it. You can then also share what your expectations for a productive process are. So for example, if my goal is for students to learn from hearing others' ideas, it's important for them to look at a substantial portion of their peers' posts. And then they're able to comment in return in rationale and responsive ways. And then finally, how do the learning analytics provide an indication of this process? Well, the percent of posts read isn't just introduced as, oh, here's a metric, look, you read this percentage of your peers' posts, but they now hopefully understand, well, I read this percentage of my peers' posts. That's important because it's showing I'm exposed to my peers' ideas, and one of the goals of this activity is to understand what my peers are thinking and maybe change my ideas. So the idea is that by the time we introduce the analytics, it's connected to what they're doing in the activity, which in and of itself I think gives them a grounding for saying, okay, well, why does this number matter? You can do this in a bunch of ways. This is just sort of excerpts from guidelines that students are given at the beginning of a course. So, discussion participation, attending to others' posts. It's important to attend other people's posts to examine and support your ideas. However, when time is limited, it's better to view a portion in depth than everything superficially. This is the thing that I have trouble putting into the analytics table, basically. So more is better, but not quantity at the expense of quality. So they get that idea, hopefully, at this point. Then we say, okay, well, the visual interface can show you the posts that you viewed in blue and the ones you haven't yet in red to help you keep track of this. And then there's a separate guideline for the other analytics that basically says the same thing, but it's now the focus is on the analytic. So this is given to students kind of as an upfront understanding as to what the analytics are about. The next piece that we try to introduce, and I think I've alluded to this a little bit, is the notion of student agency. So we're operating from a model that if students are going to change their behaviors and if they're going to buy into this, they need to have some say in what's going on with the data and what it means. I think this also addresses a lot of the concerns of surveillance. So we talk about student agency, and then we get away from this problem. And actually, we haven't had any problems with students saying, who's watching me, this idea of a ninja in the background watching what you're doing online, because they're seeing the data and they're having a say in saying what it means. So I think this gives them an opportunity to have some authority in what the data means. It provides some human context, and I'll give an example of how that turned out to be quite important. And at the end of the day, if we want action to be taken by them, we need their buy-in. And so part of the way we've gotten to this is with goal setting. So I can tell students that it's better to read more, but they're going to be able to know, well, this is where I'm at, and this is where I want to go next. I think we need to allow for different profiles of activity, especially as students are moving from their starting point, which can be quite different for different students, to what we see as an ideal endpoint. I don't expect or want every student to say, my goal is to read 100% of the posts in the discussion every week. The goal is for them to see where they're at and think about what's a reasonable proximate goal that they can aim towards next. And what do they need to do to be getting something out of the discussion? And so it's kind of starting where students are at, as opposed to imagining that they all need to have this one ideal profile as their target. And there's quite a bit of evidence that suggests that goals, especially ones that students set themselves, are going to be more motivating for them to put in greater effort, support them in monitoring their progress, and be committed if things are hard. So the way we work with goal setting is they have their guidelines, and the guidelines are purposefully, they say what's better, but they're not saying shoot for 100% everybody all the time. And then personal goal setting becomes an explicit part of the learning activity. So they have, in this case, basically a reflective online journal where they're briefly asked to set some goals for their discussion participation. And I'll say in a minute, at the end of the week, they get some analytics. They reflect on how they didn't meet their goals, what else do they notice, and they set some new goals. Since we're asking them to write an essay at the end, this actually gives them a lot of fodder and makes that process a lot easier. And I just wanted to share, these are some sample goals that students participating in a course actually set. These were graduate students. We've started with a population that we thought would be a successful one, and then we're going to move down because we think that undergraduates may need some more help in setting good goals. But we actually saw some pretty good goal setting. You know, I'm going to aim to read most of the posts in the discussion and actively participate in 2 threads plus any I create. Well, since I didn't hit last week's goal, really, I still need to do that. Also to keep the length of my posts down and get more interactive with the other kids. Not kids, but anyway. And as a goal for the next discussion, I will try to synthesize ideas from different thread areas. And I include the last one on purpose, even though that's not something the analytics tracks, because the goal setting process as we set it up points out to students that there's things that the analytics don't track directly that may still be important. And so, they're said that's different. The analytics won't inform you, but are there other goals? Are there things these analytics don't capture? So they're starting to think metacognitively about what the analytics are and aren't telling them as well. So it's not a big focus of what we're doing, but we want to make sure there's still space for things that we aren't yet measuring, so those things don't get pushed aside. We also work on the flip side of goal setting with reflection. And I think there's a bit of a danger with analytics that are always on, which is the ability to always look at them means that we don't ever really do it in depth. Or if we're constantly monitoring them, that almost takes away our energy from the actual activity. So our solution to this is to establish a rhythm for reflection. In our case, it made a lot of sense because the discussions are generally about a week or 2 long to make the reflection cycle the same length. In different contexts, it might make sense to have students be reviewing a couple times across the course of a semester, or maybe on a more frequent basis. But the notion is there's sort of a cycle at which it makes sense to reflect, and you're asking students to do it. They can evaluate their progress towards their goals. They can assess when the goals themselves might need to change. And we've also found it useful to provide a dedicated space for this. So it's not an extensive journal, right? Students aren't writing Dear Diary. It's a couple of lines once a week, but they're tracking in the same digital space what their goal was, what the analytics showed, and what they thought about it. And it keeps going on, so they can actually go back and look at this. And that gives them a chance to see how their progress has or hasn't happened, and when they're at the end of the term having to write the reflective essay. But it also just lets them keep track of things, as opposed to saying, oh, the analytics say I might do this, maybe I will, maybe I won't. It's a way for them to sort of do micro experiments on what they're doing. And obviously I picked some of the nicer ones, but I thought this was a particularly nice reflection where the students said I wanted to try and up the overall percentage of posts I reviewed. That turned out it meant I had to slow down my reading since the data wouldn't capture. This was one of those students who had looked at every single post without getting in depth and realized they needed to slow down. And maybe they know the instructor's reading, so they wrote something nice, but the overall result was I learned more and got a broader sense of the opinions concerning the reading. So they clearly at least get what we want to happen. And it seems to have been something that was useful to them. So we sort of have this top-down perspective of integration that's coming from the instructor and setting up the framework, and this bottom-up perspective from the student in being sort of an agent. And in between, we kind of think of 2 other principles. And one is the reference frame. So that's the normative data from their peers and what we're asking to use as a reference point. And also this other idea, which may be less familiar, which is this idea of dialogue. So the notion of dialogue is, if you think about all of us who work in the analytics space and we get analytics and we try and figure out what the heck they mean, it's not something where, you see the picture and it's always immediately clear. Sometimes it is, sometimes not. But if we're trying to get students to start thinking about what they're doing and then change their behavior based on it, I think there needs to be some space for thinking about what analytics mean and where to go with them. And so we think about analytics as a start, not the end of the process. And maybe there's space for negotiation, what they need to change. They may realize their numbers aren't good, but what do they do about it? So the short version is the reflective journal is something that the instructor can access. The instructor also has access to the analytics for the whole class, so they could see students who look like they might be struggling and then go look at their journals to get more context to how the student's seeing it. Because there's a big difference in helping a student who says, oh my gosh, I realize I'm struggling, I don't know what to do, and a student who seems to think they're doing fine even though the analytics are telling you differently. And this also gives the instructor sort of an easy way to give personal help where it's needed, with the student involved. So this is an example of a student who was generally a good student, but 1 week they were just a disaster in the discussion, and so they pop up as, oh, maybe the student had some trouble. But you read the comment and it turns out they've got some life situation going on, and they realize things were bad, and at least if it continues as a pattern, maybe they need help, but for now they seem fine. And this is the opposite situation. This is an instructor post, and this is a student who seems to think they're doing fine, but in fact it's pretty clear from the numbers and from the way their peers respond that they're not. And so the instructor sort of points out that, despite your comment that you made fewer posts, you're still way above the class average. It gives you sort of a neutral point to start talking with the student. And, how are you thinking about this? You said you wanted to focus on quality, not quantity, but ... Because, you can tell a student, well, post less or post more, or post longer or post shorter or post more in depth. But if they're not buying in, they're just going to engage in that as a compliance behavior. They're not going to change what they're doing in a meaningful way. And so that's where I think dialogue is time intensive, but in the cases where it's needed can be really valuable. And maybe I'll just tell you the big idea, but this was a particularly rich dialogic exchange where a student basically says, I'm overwhelmed, I see everything that's there, I feel like I need to read it, but then I change my ideas, and so while I'm trying to figure out what I want to say, other posts show up, and I don't think it's really happening all that fast, but that's how they're experiencing it. So the instructor says, a couple things about, well, you could post your initial ideas before reading everything, even if they're going to change. Maybe you want to focus on one thread. It's okay if your ideas change. That fits with the goal of what we're doing in this discussion. And the students at least seem to feel that that helped them a little bit in alleviating their stress and being overwhelmed and start to participate in ways that were better. The reference frame I think we've kind of alluded to already, but basically there's 3 reference frames we can think about that we want to make sure students are aligning to the right ones at the right times. One has to do with the guidelines we provide at the start, one has to do with their peers, sort of the normative notion, and one has to do with their own prior activity. I think peer reference point is particularly valuable and dangerous at the same time. Depending on what the group's doing, everyone may be doing really great, and so you can start feeling badly about your participation even though it might still be meeting the guidelines. And that's why we don't want to have peer as the only reference point. But it can also be very eye-opening for students to realize that, in fact, other people are doing much more than they are. So some students were really surprised to see that other students logged in more than once. Some students, realize they're below the average, and then that causes them some stress. So I think that's something we need to be careful of, because our goal isn't for everyone to do the same. Our goal isn't for it to be competitive and students to start trying to beat each other on numbers that may or may, the numbers are a proxy for what we really care about. And I think that having students have the ability to look at how they're progressing over time is a particularly powerful one, in that, students can feel good about how they're doing if they're improving, even if they're not in the same place as their peers. So that's kind of the model that we're working with for now. And these are sort of the processes we've put over it. And I mean, this is purposefully generic as a way to think about how do we think about integration, agency, dialogue, and reference frame. And I think dialogue's a particularly challenging one to use as we move to scale, but maybe still has some value in ways that we can work it. Based on some of our pilot work, we're seeing that it is possible to make the analytics use a coherent parser of the process that students engage with. We haven't had any of the big brother issues. Students seem to be fine with the data, at least in the way we've been working with it. And for the most part are embracing the ability to try and evaluate the progress and set goals. Some of them need help in doing it the ways we'd like, but they're on board with the idea of it. We found that the reflection on the data is the most powerful starting place. Usually goals before they get the data aren't very good goals, but once they see the data, they can set some better goals. But we've also seen that even when students know what they want to change, change is slow. People have habits they're used to engaging in, whether it's for online discussions or studying. And a lot of times they need help in knowing how do they change. And that seems to me to be a real piece that we need to think about helping, is not just what changes need to happen, but how do you start making them happen. The reference frames were important for making sense of the data. One thing I haven't mentioned but was interesting is that reactions to the data can be both cognitive and emotional. We've talked about this as sort of this rational process, oh, I need to do better, but we've seen students, feel stressed that their numbers aren't as good as other students. We've seen students in complete denial that the numbers accurately represent what they're doing. So I think the emotional, we have seen this, They think the computer can't track how fast they read because they read so fast. So there are things we need to think about. And I think if we're starting to move towards automatic assessment of students, the quality of students' posts, I think we're going to get a lot of pushback if they're getting negative assessments and it doesn't align with how they've seen what they're doing. So I think that managing that is going to be a really important piece. And finally, the dialogue was quite powerful, but it does present challenges for scalability. So the final points I have is that I think embedding student use of learning analytics in our teaching practices offers exciting ways to help students take charge of their own learning based on data-informed decisions. And I think it may also provide some information that can help us design better learning analytics tools. So I leave you with a question, which is, how can learning analytics change your classroom practices of teaching and learning? Or if you're developing analytics, how are you imagining that they're going to change other people's practices? Thanks.
Mm-hmm. So I really like your presentation. I like how you had a really nice theoretical grounding for your work. I have a couple questions. One is, how widespread is the use of these analytics within your university? And then what has been your colleagues' reaction to these ideas?
We're still at the pilot stage. One of the wonders and the challenges of building your own system is that we need to work on getting it more robust to scale it across places that we're not directly involved. So it's still small. I think some of the education ideas behind what we're doing in terms of making students responsible and bringing in reflection and goal setting, people are very behind. But there's a lot of distrust of numbers, especially when it comes to discourse. And so, you know, these are not the best analytics, they're not the end analytics, but I think they're useful. And usually, I think people say, well, if you're not going to look at the quality of discourse directly, then, you know, I'm not sure if it's worth my time. On the other hand, I'm not sure that they would accept automatic assessments of the discourse. And so I think showing that, you know, even low-hanging fruit and can be the start of something is important. So it's still a tough road on that, I think.
So one of the issues with scalability in teaching any large course is often to think about whether peer review or peer interactions can help. Have you done any experimentation with peers reviewing each other's reflective journals and analytics to see whether the dialogue can be scalable through those kinds of interactions? And if so, has there been resistance from students about sharing their data with other students?
We haven't, but I think that's the way we have to go. But that is one of the questions is, you know, how do you deal with showing people other people's data in the agreement? So we haven't walked down that road, but I think that's the only way to start doing dialogue at scale. So I do think we need to start moving that way.
So one of the things that I really like about this is that it gives you a window into student behavior in a much more kind of direct way. What are they actually just doing, rather than only seeing the content that they previously did? So I actually applaud that. I think that's because students need to learn what kind of acts they have to undergo in order to produce good content. It's not enough to just show them good content and say, do this. They have to learn how. So I think it's a really nice environment for that, because you can track a lot of their actual behavior in a way that you can't when they go off and do a physics homework set all the time. They just disappear for hours until they come back with good or bad work, and you don't know what they did.
Yeah, I think showing them the process that leads to successful behavior is a big piece of it, similar with the study behaviors kind of thing, or sitting in the front row. The one other thing, the one other thing I was going to mention I had a nice conversation earlier today with some of the goal setting, because some students set better goals than others. I think showing students what other students set as goals in some aggregate way, we haven't developed that yet, but I think that's another way to start using how students are engaging in this reflective process as models for others. Again, you know, because it's not about magic success, it's partially how you get there too.
So just to build on that, we know that students are individuals as well, and they all have different ways of learning. There's learning styles, maybe not from an ed theoretic perspective, but just from, there's different patterns for maybe myself and Tim when we're coming to the same class to learn based on our backgrounds, cultures, and so forth. I worry a little bit about some of the learning analytics that start to box this a little too much. And I thought maybe you could just share if you felt that that was happening, or how this kind of system could be augmented to allow or encourage that idea that I am an individual, even though these are patterns of success in other people. They may be useful for me, they may not be useful for me.
So I think that's a really tough line, and that's sort of the space between this sort of integration and guidelines that we're telling students, that we know students who do this are more successful, and the notion of agency. Because I do think we need a space for student agency and for students to be individuals and work on this and that goal. But I think we also don't want it to be completely relativistic, because if most students who do this are doing better, you think that when you do this you're not doing better. So the question is then, can we start to track it? So if a student says to me, well, most students learn better when they're doing this, but it's different for me, if it's something we're tracking, then that gives them a chance to test it. And that's that idea of micro-experiment. So I think that's the way maybe it comes in. I mean, I'm also a believer in having a suite of analytics. I don't want to ever provide them with one number. I want to give them a range of metrics, because I think, and then as I mentioned, we try to leave room for thinking about things that aren't included. So those are the ways we're thinking about it, but I do think it's important, if we know that a certain pattern is generally good for students, it can't just be, well, that doesn't apply to me, or the system doesn't calculate how fast I read a post, because then that just sort of leaves a backdoor that makes the analytics meaningless. And so we want to allow for individuality, but keep the claims data-based as much as possible.
So I have a sort of related question and thought, which is, instead of looking at the question of how do these individuals fit into this chat room environment, chat rooms and whatever that thing is that students are doing is all over the place. And you're taking a look at it from an analytic perspective and trying to tease out how can we get people to use this tool more effectively, right? And my question is, do you feel that, from your own experience as you started looking at this tool, do you feel that you have actually, through the analytics, uncovered new ideas about what would be the right guidance to give people using this tool? Or do you feel that you more kind of were able to take these ideas that you knew, probably for other reasons, were going to help people be successful, and just like guide them to using those ideas?
Well, so in this case, most of the analytics we developed came from prior research, but I think what you're suggesting is, could we find new analytics that might basically be leading to new guidelines as we keep going?
I'm kind of curious what your experience was with the chat room environment in particular. Was it looking at the data that really helped you figure out, like, yes, these are 6 things that we think are, indicative of a successful experience in the chat room, or?
In this case, we built that environment based on the prior research. So it really was it was the analytics, though they were just data metrics to start off with that said, okay, well, when students do this, they're more successful. Are we seeing that in the new environment? So I think we have new ideas from the design, but I'm not sure that they've come from the analytics as much as the user studies of how people interacted with the interface. I think that's possible. It's just it hasn't happened in this case, and I think it's because we came from a pretty a multi-year project that had already been looking at that and collecting data on it. So that sort of wasn't our path. Oh, sorry.
So in a lot of courses, class online discussion is evaluated as great. So how does this fit in that sort of sense? Because it seems to me, once you introduce an evaluation component, it really changes what people will do. And have you looked at it in such courses?
So the online discussions were evaluated in this case. But we haven't had a chance to run experiments and seeing how the analytics do and don't change that. What we've tried to do, because I think there's a danger of you don't want to tell students you're evaluated directly based on the percentage of posts that you've read. And so that's why we have those sort of 2 levels. So the level is you want to read, not scan, a broad representation of your peers' posts. So students can amass evidence, which is the percentage. So one student might say, look, I read 86% of the posts in this week, or I read above 80% of the posts in all the weeks, and that's my evidence. Or another student might say, I know I started off not so good, but look how I improved. So what we're trying to do is set the standards for evaluation, not with the metrics, but show how the metrics connect to them so they can be used as part of the student's argument for why they're meeting them. But we haven't had a chance to look and to see, because we have classes we run where we ask students to do the same thing without the metrics. So hopefully we can introduce the metrics there and then see whether that's changing the arguments they make and then how they're doing their interactions on the way. I think that'd be pretty neat. And I do think that the assessment is so key because online discussions, had an earlier conversation, right? Online discussions are very often evaluated on how often you post or how often you log in or all sorts of things that are really bad proxies for what we want to be going on. So I think both putting it in the students' hands to mount the argument, but also providing them with some evidence to do so. But even when we have some metrics on the content, again, we're going to have the same kinds of issues, is that we're not expecting every student to have 100%, and we don't want them to only rely on the numbers. We want to also know what the numbers mean and have them be able to say, I'm seeing these numbers as indicative of this kind of thing that I think I'm doing.
Basic methodology question, were these courses all online or were they hybrid?
That is a good question. Mostly hybrid is how we run. We do have some online courses that right now have the reflective component but not the analytics as of yet.
Just maybe as a good summary, you mentioned early that 4 years ago when you started this project, it wasn't analytics. And I think most of us came to analytics by discovering it. Can you talk just a little bit about that, how you came to identify with the analytics movement, or what you've gotten out of it, or how it's changed your orientation for research, or pick any of those.
Well, I guess a good question is how it's changed my orientation. And so we started off trying to figure out which metrics were good, and we had a whole research planned out on looking at all the different things. But we got to a point where we said, okay, we don't know everything, but we know enough to make some good recommendations. And someone sort of said, well, why not show this to the students? And so I think my focus has switched somewhat into sort of trying to find more ideal or more perfect representations of things, to trying to say, how do we take the things we do know and start to make them actionable and useful in sustainable ways? Hence my focus on the intervention, as opposed to, and we haven't been developing new analytics right now. We're working on saying, how do we make what we have useful? And the other thing that I think, I don't know if this has changed, but I think maybe because this came from a research project and was inherently, it wasn't built for scale, and that's one of the things we've sort of struggled with. But I think one advantage is that we took something that we thought could work, and in the implementations, it's not fully automated. There's still a lot of scotch tape on the back end, but it works. And we brought it out to the world, and we learned a lot of things. For example, students' denial of certain metrics that we wouldn't even have, I would have never imagined that a student would just say, oh no, it's not calculating right. Well, we checked, it is. But that's their reaction, and that's really important. So the transparency of the calculation or how you get their buy-in becomes important. So I think that learning analytics that were developed, they can't be developed in a vacuum. So I think that, to me, if I'm going to be working in this space, I need to find things that sort of take the minimally functional set of learning analytics out to the world, because I think that's going to inform the design of the analytics. And so to me, that's been a big change in focus, in that it really needs to go out there and see how it's going to be useful to students, because that's probably going to change how I'm designing the tools.